Hello, gang, and welcome back. Tattooed Biker here with you, and tonight I've got 4 true Bigfoot sighting stories to share with you, all submitted by viewers just like yourself. I do have an early warning on this one, though. The first one is pretty graphic and might be a bit triggering for some. But now, if you're ready, grab your boots and let's ride to Bigfoot country. Number 1. Dear TB, I want to tell you about my Bigfoot experience. It was 1978, about 20 miles west of Denver in Golden, Colorado. This was right before my family moved out to Montana. I and a buddy of mine were 16 years old at the time. And what we did was we kind of liked to sneak out of the house at night, you know. This was on Lookout Mountain Road. We come around a corner and there's a recreation area on the right side. They have company picnics in there, with a baseball diamond, picnic tables, etc. There was this tall creature standing near the pitcher's mound, beating a large dog with a stick. This thing was at least 8 feet tall, and it clearly wasn't human. I could tell that right away. Yeah, it was definitely a Bigfoot. And the dog was either unconscious or dead. Right across the street is the nature center, and there's a big stone gate, and there's a very strong Chinook wind blowing. We get behind the gate, and we're just watching this scene play out. It's got the dog by the tail, and it's hitting this dog on the head. It had the dog in its left hand and the stick in the right, holding it out, you know. I turned to my friend and I whispered, I forget exactly what I whispered, but something along the lines of, "Can you believe this?" The thing suddenly whipped its head towards us, like maybe it heard me whisper. We had to at least be 100 yards away from it. Maybe the heavy wind allowed my voice to carry. We were downwind. And it suddenly took off running, and it must have covered 200 yards in 5 seconds or so. After a few minutes, we walked over to the dog. But by that time, the poor thing was severely mangled and dead. About an hour later, after retrieving a shovel, we buried that dog in the woods. There was no collar or identification on it. To this day, I have no idea why Bigfoot was beating that dog. Even after all these years, my friend and I still talk about the incident. Thanks for letting me share. Signed, Pete. Number 2. Hey, Biker. I have something I'd like to share. You see, I like to spend some alone time occasionally. Last fall, in October of 2023, I spent a day in the Allegheny National Forest in northwest Pennsylvania. I like the forest because of the tall trees and nature. I'm able to relax and think to myself without interference. I got there early in the morning, just as dawn was breaking. I got out of my truck and hiked to Rimrock Overlook. As I walked, I was admiring the blanket of fog draping the Allegheny Reservoir. I had my binoculars and my camera and wanted to go deeper into the woods. The daylight was just peeking through the forest, and the wildlife was beginning to wake and become active. As I was watching the birds with my binoculars, out of nowhere came this weird sound. It was like a mix of a deep growl and a long moaning that just echoed throughout the forest. It was so surprising and different from the usual forest noises, and it gave me this really creepy feeling. My heart was racing while I stood there not moving, still holding the binoculars to my eyes, looking around anxiously, trying to figure out where the sound might be coming from. And that's when I saw it. It looked like someone or something moving past in the dense brush. It was huge and somewhat hidden by the fog. As soon as I noticed it, it vanished. I stood there completely freaked out. I thought maybe it was a bear or an elk or a deer, but that unfamiliar noise had me thinking that it was something outside the ordinary. After a few minutes of whatever it was vanishing, the forest came back to normal, and that left me just standing there, equal parts scared and curious. Then it showed itself again, but further down to my right. I guess it was about 50 yards away from me this time. Whatever it was appeared as tall as a young tree, around 8 feet, and with shoulders well over 4 feet wide. It moved in a way that was smooth, like it was gliding, and very strange. I didn't want to blink and miss it. This creature quickly moved around bushes and jumped over logs, surprisingly silently. The fur looked rough and its colors shifted between light brown and red as the sunlight hit it. I could see that it had a wide back, big muscular arms, and a flat face. The odor, that was when I was smelling it, was what really scared me. It was faint, like a rotten smell that seemed to stick in my nose. It made me nervous and my heart started pounding. I wanted to run to my truck, but I was just too curious. Then suddenly, the thing turns its head towards me and I just froze. I briefly saw its huge forehead and distinct brow. But then suddenly it was gone. It simply vanished into the thick forest, just as quietly as it had first appeared. I saw something weird that I can't explain. Was it a Sasquatch or a Bigfoot? I finally decided to walk back to my truck. My mind was literally going crazy. Every little sound sent an alert, and I just couldn't feel safe anymore. That night at home, I experienced a series of bizarre dreams. It was as if the creature was communicating with me. I know all that sounds crazy, but that is what happened. In fact, it took several weeks until the dreams would stop. I had this overwhelming feeling that I was supposed to return and find answers. I've resisted returning to the area because of my fear of encountering the creature, or maybe something even more terrifying. Signed, Sam. Number 3. Dear Biker, I have a really strange encounter that I wanted to relate to you and your listeners. This happened several years ago while living on a farm in the Midwest. You see, I was checking on the animals when the weather radio blared out a tornado warning. I wasn't too surprised, as there was a large storm over the area. This was southeast Oklahoma, and there was already an advisory in effect. I closed up the barn door and hurried off toward the house, meeting with my kids and my husband. Halfway, there are tornado shelters and an old dugout house on the left side of a hill from when my family first moved into the area. Tornadoes occur fairly often in our area. We got ourselves into the shelter and we barred the metal door. This dugout has had a few upgrades over the past few years, but the metal door was there from the beginning. My great-grandparents lived in the dugout for 5 years, until they met the Homestead Act requirements. My great-grandpa didn't mind the dugout, but my great-great-grandma has a whole different story. My husband keeps the dugout prepared for anything. His dad was a kid living in Woodward, Oklahoma, when the Woodward tornado had come through. His family survived the destruction, but they became preachers of preparedness after that. He made sure that the dugout was stocked with a week's worth of canned food, water, a radio, flashlights, and batteries. We never had to use more than the radio and the flashlight in all these years of occasional tornado warnings, until this particular tornado, that is. About 5 minutes after we settled into the dugout, the wind started really picking up outside. We could hear thunder and rain outside the doors. We started hearing the impacts of large hail hitting the metal dugout door. The sound of the wind changed to a roar, similar to a plane about to take off. And we could hear the different sounds of objects hitting the door, but then we heard a loud crack and a lot of scraping. In total, the entire event lasted maybe 7 minutes, but we didn't try to leave the dugout until the wind had completely died down. My husband unbarred the door and tried opening it, but it would only open about an inch. We could see through the crack that the apple tree next to the dugout had blown over in front of the door. We tried to pry it open every which way, slamming our bodies against the door, but nothing worked. We were officially stuck down in that shelter. We knew at some point there would be people checking on places in the tornado's path, so we stuck a piece of wood in the crack to hold it open and get comfortable, being prepared to wait. My husband never thought about latrine logistics for if you were trapped in a shelter. When 7 p.m. rolled around, we discovered that claustrophobia and panic attacks can strike anyone, no matter how prepared you are. We were safe and we were prepared physically for a week, but I'm not sure our minds could have lasted that long. We could see it was dark through the crack of the door, and that's when a foul odor wafted in. It smelled like a wet dog, combined with a male goat and a teenager's armpits. I thought it was an overly pungent skunk, and I went to shut the door, but then I stopped when I heard what sounded like human footsteps. We started suddenly yelling for help, calling out to whoever was out there, but nobody responded. There was a shuffling sound, and the smell got even stronger. My eyes were literally watering as I yelled out and pounded on the door. Then I heard a grunt before the sound of footsteps and the odor started fading away. The kids asked why the person didn't help us, and I didn't know, but I told them that maybe they were going for extra help. It didn't explain why the person didn't at least talk to us. The footsteps eventually returned. We yelled and pounded on the door again, to no response. The footsteps and the odor faded away again, and this time I felt uneasy, and I barred the door shut. 2 times this person came and ignored our calls for help. Something wasn't right about the situation. The kids and my husband fell asleep, and I kept an ear out for rescuers for a few hours. Around 3 a.m, my daughter woke up from a nightmare and started crying. I was trying to comfort her when I heard branches cracking and scraping against the door, along with a deep, guttural grunting. I woke my husband up, and we pounded on the door and yelled. And we could suddenly smell that odor again, so we left the door bar just in case. When the noises outside eventually stopped, we waited about 10 minutes to try and open the door. This time the door opened enough for us to step out. The trunk of the tree was still lying near the door, but there was a pile of branches off to the side. There were a lot of footprints, but they were bigger than any foot that I've ever seen. We woke up our son, and we all left the dugout and headed back towards the house. It was still dark, but we could see that for the most part, the tornado didn't do much damage. We checked the house, and I headed out to the barn to see if the animals were okay. I was about halfway there when I heard one of our hogs screaming. I ran off towards the barn and stopped a few yards away. I could see my market-ready Hampshire barrow struggling and screaming while slung over the shoulder of a dark, hulking, human-like figure. I yelled out to the figure to drop my pig, and it just turned and looked at me. I shined my flashlight on the creature's face. It had a grayish face with a flat-looking nose. It had thin, dark brown hair covering its body and massive feet. After a few seconds, it turned and walked into our cornfield towards the creek and then disappeared from our view. I've seen Finding Bigfoot, so I know what I was looking at. I know for sure it was a Bigfoot. I talked to my mom, and she said that she had seen the wild people often when she was a kid. My great-great-grandpa had installed the metal door on the dugout after hearing stories of wild people in the area, but the only trouble they ever seemed to cause was stealing livestock, like what I had seen. We've had animals seemingly disappear into thin air over the years, and it all makes sense now. By that point, I didn't mind the loss of that pig. The wild people had rescued my family from the dugout. Thanks for reading. Signed, Deborah. Number 4. Hey TB, I grew up in southern Utah, near the Glen Canyon area, and well, I encountered something strange down there. I lived out in the middle of nowhere, and we had a bunch of dogs. There were a lot of hitchhikers since we lived on a main road that goes through there. My dad was a local police officer and worked long days and nights. One night, the dog starts barking and he just stuck his gun out the door. And he said, "Hey, go figure out what that is." So I went. We had one dog out at each corner of the property. And we had an actual pump house to pump water. So we lived that far out of town. I checked the dogs and they were very, very upset. I got to one dog and she is just cowering down on the ground, shaking. At first, I thought she was hurt, but she wasn't, just really scared. When I checked on her, I got the distinct feeling that I didn't check behind me very well. So when I started to turn around, something stood up and suddenly ran away from me. I didn't hear anything other than crunching sounds in the dry brush as it was running. We lived on the side of a really steep hill, running right down the side of that incline. On the bottom of that hill were trees and a river, and I could hear limbs and trees breaking all along the way. By the time I realized what had gone on, I got to the side of the hill to see where it was going. It made it all the way down. It was a very steep hill. I could hear the tree branches breaking off, and I was petrified. I was shaking so bad that if I'd wanted to shoot it, I would have never been able to. I was that terrified as I was shaking. My dad called the county sheriff, who had a professional tracker or hunter by the name of Billy, and they brought him in. I thought it was a bear because of how big it was, but it ran on 2 legs. Billy looked at the footprint impressions, and he said if this was a bear, it was bigger than anything he had ever tracked, and he had been doing it for 30 years. After talking to Billy a bit more, he said that he thought it was a Bigfoot. He said that he had tracked a few over the years, but this one was much, much larger. Yeah, the experience was terrifying, and there were sightings in that area for a couple of weeks after that. There were even a few instances of property damage, and at least reports of 2 sheep being killed. I feel like that thing could have easily ripped me apart if it had wanted to. Thanks for reading. Signed, Vince. And there it is. All the Bigfoot sightings and reports that I have for tonight. What did you think about these? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below, but please keep them respectful to the submitters. These sightings have been known to leave lasting trauma. But anyways, thanks so much for watching. And as always, stay curious, stay vigilant, stay safe, and I'll be seeing you on down the road a ways. Biker, out.